bom dia, bem-vindos ao último painel da nossa conferência sobre as alterações climáticas e a transição energética e a sustentabilidade ambiental do Clube de Lisboa. Como é tradição no Clube de Lisboa, nós fechamos as nossas atividades com uma mesa redonda trazendo jovens ativistas e participantes de um pouco de todo o lado do mundo. E nesta mesa redonda nós temos o Diogo Silva, que está aqui à minha esquerda, que é coordenador do Climate Justice Climáximo, que tem sede na Costa da Caparica. Teremos a Gabriela Polo, que é Program Manager do Fish Forever na América Central. A Luiana Guerra, diretora do EcoAngola em Luanda. O Matt Scott, que é Manager of Storytelling and Engagement at the Project Drawdown em Washington, D.C., nos Estados Unidos. Como em todos os nossos painéis, há tradução simultânea para português e inglês. Quem estiver aqui na sala e quer ouvir a conversa que se segue em português deve usar o canal 1. Quem quiser seguir em inglês deve usar o canal 2. Quem estiver a acompanhar a conferência via Zoom deve escolher a língua no ícone na parte de baixo do ecrã. No ícone tem um globozinho na parte de baixo do ecrã. E nós temos também, faltava-me aqui uma página, ainda a Mónica Nagashima, Japan Country Manager of InfluenceMap, que está em Tóquio, e a Vitória Kramer, coordenadora do Rio Grande do Sul Hub for Youth Climate Leadership, em Porto Alegre, no Brasil. Welcome to all, bem-vindos a todos. Nós vamos ter uma mesa redonda, portanto este é um diálogo entre todos, portanto sintam-se à vontade de interromper, de mudar o tópico, comentar e acrescentar. E para lançar o nosso diálogo, eu gostava de fazer uma primeira pergunta para todos, que é como é que a opinião pública, as políticas públicas e as atitudes dos cidadãos e das organizações têm vindo a alterar-se face ao risco e aos problemas que as alterações climáticas nos colocam. E eu deixo a pergunta para quem quiser tomar em primeiro lugar. Não sei se, Diogo, queres... anyone online who would like to take the first stab at the question?
I can go. Okay, so first of all, thank you for the opportunity for being here. It is a pleasure. I would like to thank Clube de Lisboa and especially YCL, Youth Climate Leaders, which is the organization I'm a part of. And if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have the opportunity to be here and to speak up for the pledges of youth on climate change. So when it comes to local action and collective action and how NGOs and people can be more participative in this process, I think it's very important to highlight how young people have been historically kind of overlooked and how our pledges are not always being heard and not always taken seriously. So it's really nice to have this space here where we can share our dreams, our goals for the future. And specifically when we talk about climate change and talking about local action in Brazil, for example, we have two great leaderships, indigenous women, young indigenous women, Chai Surui and Alice Patachá, who have made relevant speeches during the opening ceremonies of COP26 and COI in last year. So they talked about how important it is for us to realize that vulnerable communities and indigenous people, they have been talking about the future for a long time, and we are not paying attention to it. So when we talk about decarbonization or when we talk about protecting our forests, how nature cannot be seen as a natural resource to be used, and we can expect the impacts of that on the planet and on our future. we must pay attention. We must pay close attention to what they are saying, because they, better than anyone here, they know what they are talking about, because they have this strong connection with nature, and it's not something separate from their lives, their daily lives. So I think it is very symbolic to have spaces such as those and this one to talk about it. And I like to invite, I don't know, I'm not going to say any names, but
Right,
to go on. Okay.
I could continue from there, and I definitely agree with that point of the local communities being so central to the progress that we see, and something that I'm so thankful for that I've seen in my work at Project Drawdown. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but our work is all around the world, really serving as a resource for climate solutions. And I find it really hopeful that, like, for instance, in 2017, Project Drawdown released the Drawdown book, which is a resource for so many communities, and we're very familiar with a number of organizations, including youth climate leaders, for example, who have been using Drawdown and some of the resources that we've shared that share climate solutions with the world. And so the hopeful thing that I see is that many communities, and that includes corporations, that includes governments and cities, that includes philanthropies, academic institutions, individuals, are wondering more and more how they could integrate climate solutions into their work, and they're starting to see the benefits beyond reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which has historically been one of the key things in the conversation. It's really hopeful that people are thinking about the co-benefits of climate solutions. So jobs, what jobs are we creating? What health? How are we improving people's health? How are we improving communities for years to come, for our generation, but also the generation after that? And so it's great that people are really engaging, and something that I think is also positive is that people are starting to see that we need local communities, that we need to bring in a wide, diverse range of people, whatever that looks like in our individual countries, to be part of the solution, because it's not going to be just the quote unquote decision makers and the status quo that is solving climate change and coming up with climate solutions. It's going to be a wide range of people. It's going to take all of us to be part of the solution. And so I'm thankful that more people are starting to see the urgency and starting to take action.
Thank you, Matt. And I like to add to what Matt just said. First of all, thank you also for hosting me. It's a little early for me, so apologies if I don't make full sense. So I would agree that kind of that action across all levels is critical, and really, if we're going to win this battle against climate change, we're going to need both systemic and individual change. And at Rare, we are a behavior change organization. So I did want to hone in some of those individual behaviors that can change if we are to face, global warming and those challenges. And I want to acknowledge that many of today's challenges and crises that we face environmentally have been caused by unsustainable human behaviors. So pushing for changes of those behaviors is going to be key. And I also want to acknowledge that as individuals, as people, our everyday actions and choices can have an impact in solving or perpetuating a problem. So Rare right now is pushing for a program that's focused on changing behaviors of individuals in wealthier nations that can help shift key behaviors. And some of these behaviors that are changing, and already people start to do these to kind of solve the climate crisis, are adopting, for instance, a climate-rich diet, or buying carbon offsets so that you can start taking out some carbon out of the atmosphere, or switching to renewable energy sources and avoid wasting food. And if you can cycle or take public transit to work, maybe invest in an electric vehicle, and avoiding flights where possible. Those are kind of the 6 big behaviors that we're pushing so that we can cut back on emissions as individuals. And while these collective individual shifts in behavior can be really powerful and are critically important, I also wanted to acknowledge that they might not be enough to get to the point where we need to be, and that we will also need kind of this major global shifts in policy to fundamentally change the way that our economies are run. We will need an overhaul in our energy matrix so that we can power our homes, transfer and manufacture our goods, and also grow our food, so that we can stop relying on fossil fuels. So this combination of individual change and shifts with policy changes are really the only way to ensuring that change we need happens at the right scale and the right pace.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Monica. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored to be speaking to everyone tonight. So to add to the last point mentioned by Gabriela, I completely agree that policy change is absolutely vital. And that is something that was highlighted in the IPCC report for 1.5 degrees, that we need to see unprecedented interventions by the government. And a lot of scientists will agree that the major obstacle to meaningful climate action for the past decades has been obstructive corporate behavior. And at InfluenceMap, we are a think tank, and we analyze and we rate corporate action on climate and energy policy. So one of the things that we are finding is that for years, obviously the heavy emitting energy intensive industries that are most affected by climate regulation have been the ones most vocally opposing any meaningful policy. However, we're also starting to see a shift because there are emerging companies that are saying, hey, look, we want to change. We need to procure more renewables. Our customers are demanding it, or our supply chains are requiring it. Or, hey, we're a global company and we want to operate in some of these markets that are having tighter regulations. But for example, in the case of Japan, our renewable energy share is not as high as in Europe. And the prices for renewables have also been high, and there have just been major obstacles. And so companies that are operating in Japan are saying, no, listen, we need an overhaul of policy so that we can become greener and that we can be competitive around the world. And so we are seeing companies, especially in the demand side sector, sort of in the downstream, of course, like IT companies, they're becoming vocal supporters of more progressive climate action. And that is something we need to see on a larger scale and across more sectors around the world.
Let's see if I can work this out. Yeah, it's quite an interesting question about awareness and if it's there or if it's not. For me, the main question is, are we failing or not? And then why are we failing or not? And what we've seen is that since the IPCC report in 2018, we had a decade or a little more than a decade back then to cut in half global emissions. And what we are seeing is that even though we had a pandemic in the middle, we are still failing to do that. The emissions are not coming down. And if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, we now have only 8 years to reduce in half the global greenhouse gas emissions. And so for me, the question is then, what's failing? And for me, it will be definitely the awareness is already out there, and the global mass movement of people that came to the streets in 2019 was a huge show of hope and of a different path forward, but it still wasn't enough. And I say this also as an activist. I say that we are failing, and we must acknowledge that we are failing to do the shift that we need. And then the question is, where is that awareness being put into place? And I would say the awareness is out there for people to know the problem, but then in terms of what kind of solutions will lead us to the place where we need to be in less than 10 years, I would say that's also a failure that we are having now. As you can see also from this panel, and I bet we have some disagreements, and that's fine, and that's the kind of dialogue I think we need to have. Individual actions only go to a certain way because of a huge inequality that we have in individual emissions. And we can see, for instance, 1% of the people overall in the globe cause more than 50% of emissions in aviation. We can see the main difference between countries, between continents, between classes between a lot of different things. So if we don't tackle that in the path forward to the solutions, what I say is that the power will concede nothing without a demand back. And we don't have any demand. Our only demand is for a livable future for all humanity. And that's the path forward I would say we have to make.
Thank you. Victoria, you want to come in this?
Yes, please. I think it's a very good point you made. And when you think about youth networks and activism collectives, I think it's very important to note that when we think about the future of work and when we think about the future of society where we are headed to, we are talking about the huge changes we need to make, and we need to change mainly the West development models that we have implemented in the last few centuries and that have been leading us to this climate doom, maybe, I don't know. We need to talk about a different future. You know, when we talk about change and we talk about learning from the past, it is the future we're talking about, because it is all we have. We have nothing but the future. And we need to have different perspective on consumption and growth and the way that we organize society overall, so that we can guarantee that we have social justice and that we have climate justice at the center of our politics. So even in the most optimistic scenarios for climate change, the future will impose new challenges when it comes to food production, when it comes to access to water, when it comes to resilience, energy, and other areas that are going to demand mitigation and adaptation strategies. So this will also demand new skills for future workers. So this is when we come to play. Young people do need to have a say in how we will structure our economy globally so that it can meet the emerging needs for a greener future and for a more inclusive future. So this is why I think it is important to create opportunity for young people to access the labor market. And this is a very important step also for empowering our voices, and especially when we talk about the global south and people who have traditionally been excluded for this movement. We need to change the approaches in terms of development, understanding that decarbonization can only be successful if it also integrates strategies for historical compensation for the so-called least developed countries. Climate justice cannot be dissociated from historical reparation, even especially when you talk about the effects of colonization and seeing nature as a resource to be exploited and not as a part of our daily lives. So I think the sooner that we understand those dynamics and the shifts in those dynamics, the better it is for the future that expects us.
Matt, would you like to join in?
Yeah, I would just add, and I'm really thinking about just this idea of, or this question really of, are we failing and how are we doing in addressing this problem? And I think actually this ties in somewhat with what Victoria was saying about, I think it's so important that we have a base level of understanding of these problems, of these solutions, and we don't have that. If in looking at the United States alone, for instance, our education system is not only different from state to state across 50 states, but it's different from like city to city, from zip code to zip code, from place to place. And so we don't have people on the same page about the problem to start with and educated about the problem to the same level, to the point where, while thankfully, looking at Yale's public opinion maps on climate change, I believe the average is that about 70, or it might be about 72% of people believe and realize that climate change is a problem. If you look across different areas, you'll have some states where there are only 50% of people who believe that climate change is a problem, and others where it's 80%. And we need to get on the same page. But the other thing I would say is that we also need to understand what we're working toward. So we're not really, I do think that there's so much more that we need to do. And at Project Drawdown, we say that it's important to work to reach drawdown, this point in time when the greenhouse gases stop climbing and start steadily declining, like as quickly, as safely, and as equitably as possible. But we haven't established what success looks like. So it's hard to, I think it's clear that we're failing, but it's also hard to say what it is that we're trying to do collectively, especially when different countries, different communities want to do different things. And so there's definitely work that needs to be done for us to become more aligned and to get on the same page when it comes to what we're actually working toward, and also to understand the systemic issues that are, that underlie the work that we're doing. So we talked about earlier, or what was mentioned earlier was the people out in the streets and protests, and that is really important, but also that's not necessarily the way to get corporations and governments to shift, as we've seen. And so what action do we need to take to get those major players to shift, in addition to getting individuals to get on board and to care about climate solutions?
Gabriela?
Thank you. I just wanted to emphasize, I think, a point that Vitória started to make in her last intervention about how one of our best allies in this fight is nature. So I think another critical piece of the puzzle is going to be protecting and restoring those critical ecosystems like coral reefs and forests that are not only acting as carbon sinks, but are also really sustaining livelihoods for millions of communities across the globe, and they are also helping regulate climate. So I think nature-based solutions and really relying on that incredible asset that we still have, right, in this fight is going to be crucial, in addition to that systemic change that Vitória was pointing to, and this also the change that Matt was pointing to, and really getting on the same page and engaging a broad actor range.
Monica?
Thank you. All great points. I would add as well that one recent sort of positive outcome that we're seeing is that investors are becoming increasingly concerned about what their companies are doing on climate change. And so as we specialize in looking at corporate footprint on policy, we are seeing a lot of greenwashing and PR coming out from every company. If let's take the auto sector. Every automaker has announced over the past year that they will have some kind of battery electric vehicles. But if you look under the hood, you can see that most of their production plans haven't really changed. Their new targets are just a small percentage. And then more importantly, they still keep telling the governments behind closed doors or even in public communication, they're still publishing things in the media that are against battery electric vehicles, that are against stricter regulations, against ICE phase outs that are being announced by governments around the world. So we need to make sure that as civil society, we keep those companies accountable, that if you are in a sort of investor position, that you speak or engage with your company against these practices, because clearly they're not aligned with what the company is saying. And more importantly, they're not aligned with the science dictated by the IPCC. And as someone mentioned, we only have 8 years until 2030. And this decade is going to be really critical in trying to shift the different sectors away from this negative behavior. And yeah, I would say especially the power sector, because we already have the solutions. It's unacceptable that, we are delaying action in the power sector, and then autos and, heavy industry and so on.
Thank you, Wal. I was listening to you, and the two key aspects of what you were saying, and which I heard a lot over the years, is social and environmental justice. It's two main goals that I've come across with young people all over the world and everywhere. And you also mentioned shifting public policy, shifting corporations, etc. Are you less alone nowadays that you were, say, 5 years ago, on the fight for climate change and social justice, or do you still feel that you are a voice in the desert, very much alone on these issues? Who wants to be the voice in the desert?
I will be the first voice in the desert. And, maybe this is a different perspective from what some of the other panelists might share. But for me, I would say that it really in the last 5 years, I found more of my place when it comes to climate change and global warming, especially looking at the US. I mean, most of our climate organizations, and I work with a climate organization, so I know this, are primarily like one demographic. It's not representative of underrepresented groups necessarily. And so you have a small percentage of the population that is from Black communities, from Indigenous communities, people of color, and again, other underrepresented groups represented in these spaces. And so for me, for a long time, I actually didn't feel that I felt belonging. I didn't feel belonging in the climate space. I actually grew up watching a show called Captain Planet, and it featured these planeteers who were animated and doing great things for the world, and they were a diverse range of characters. And for a long time, I couldn't see that in the climate space. And it wasn't until I saw that I felt belonging, and I saw, oh, wow, I could make a difference when it comes to climate change and global warming. I could be part of the solution. And so while I think that there's still a lot of work to get more voices engaged and a more diverse range of voices, including youth voices, for me, it's like seeing panels like this and seeing like diverse groups like this that has gotten me engaged. And so I hope that trend will continue and that we'll see more people feel comfortable engaging and see more people feel like they're part of a community rather than being alone in the desert.
Victoria?
Yes, it's a very interesting question because I can say that I feel less alone. I feel like I am a part of a collective of activists and people that have been on this road way before than me, for longer than me. And it is nice to be a part of it and to be able to identify with people and to have share ideas and dreams and goals. But at the same time, this can be really overwhelming because if, people are getting more conscious about the dangers of climate change and they are wanting to take action, at the same time, the challenges, they are also growing bigger. So it seems that it's not enough to have people advocating for it if there's not actual change happening. And when I talk about Brazil in particular, for the last 5 or 4 years, we have been facing some setbacks in terms of reaching out and achieving, like, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. We have been on downhill in that areas, and it can be really disappointing and overwhelming when we think about how deforestation is increasing and how the minings and other predatory activities, they are underlying our capacity to build a greener future. So we feel so small when it comes to these important areas. And when we think about a future, when we look at how powerful those connections can be in those networks, such as this, we feel less alone. So it also, I think it's a paradox that at the same time that we are dealing with huge responsibilities and intergenerational conversations, at the same time, we can feel more empowered by those connections that we made in the past.
Yeah, it's also quite an interesting question about if we are talking to the desert or not. Literally in Portugal right now, 99% of the country is under drought. So that's the reference, and we are in February, so we should be in the middle of the winter, and it's 20 degrees outside. Today is going to be 22 degrees Celsius, and that's the reality we are facing. I would say we are less and less alone, definitely, and that's the very good point. But then we also need to understand who will need the people, who us need to be, how would we need to be to reach a popular movement and to reach the scale that we need to reach. And for that, I think for a long time, we as climate movement, and I would include myself in that, have been talking in a way and then been communicating in a way that's not appealing to the masses. In some ways, like the idea of climate change for a long time was the polar bear, for instance. When people are concerned about jobs, when people are concerned about food, when people are concerned about housing, when people are concerned about very basic needs, and that's the reality of most of the people living in the world. Of course, the empathy you can have for a polar bear being in distress, it's quite low compared to the empathy you have for the problems you already face in your own life. So I think we also need to shift the movement to a discourse and a narrative that actually, and a story that includes the people that are suffering the most and that are the least responsible for creating the problem of climate chaos that we are heading to. And so that's also our responsibility to make sure that we can change that discourse and have an even more diverse array of people in the movement.
Thank you. Gabriela?
Well, in my experience, so I work very closely with coastal communities in Honduras and in Guatemala. And I think we're starting to see not only kind of this growth in awareness that there's a problem. And as Diogo mentions, like I think we can all agree that coastal communities are one of the communities that will see the most impacts of climate change with rising seas, and are already starting to see it. Honduras, just a few years back, just saw 2 major hurricanes hit it back to back, and a lot of the communities that we work with, that I work with, were terribly affected. So you see in people this growing understanding and awareness that there's something going on. And I'm also inspired by these communities I work with every day, because there's also this growing move to change that and to take action in actually conserving the resources that are going to, and the ecosystems that are going to help them kind of adapt better, right, and mitigate those impacts. So I think it's really inspiring for me to see kind of that awareness and that change at that level. And I think it tells you a lot, because as Diogo mentioned, they're the ones that are the least responsible for what's happening, but they're the ones on the front lines taking action and actually making, doing something every day to help the world fight this crisis that we're in. So I think we need more of that. We need more of that activism. We need more of that change, not only in coastal communities and in developing nations, but we also need to see it from the developed world and our policymakers, so that they match. And again, we go to the theme of justice, right? Like, this needs to be equitable. That needs to be equitable approach in how we go about this problem.
Thank you. Matt, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I would just like to add, it's really interesting to think about these 2 topics at once, the idea of how we communicate about climate change, but also having stories that are really representative of a wider range of the population and of a lot of communities, including coastal communities and the global south, that are often overlooked in the conversation. But what I think about, especially when Diogo talks about just the ways that we communicate being really ineffective, is my work at Project Drawdown, because I lead our program focused on storytelling. And I joined the Project Drawdown team a year and a half ago, actually, after 5 years working with a wide range of organizations, like with the US government, and specifically with NASA, the US aid program, with the Australian government, with Nike, Walmart, and just a wide range of these organizations that wanted to shift more toward better practices when it comes to food and the circular economy, and supporting that shift to some extent. And so, in those spaces and in that work, something that I really realize is that there, number one, are a lot of voices that aren't often represented. And so my work focuses on bringing those voices into, not into the conversation, but amplifying those voices in the conversation as much as possible, so that we're not, again, only looking to the same people for solutions and for perspectives on solutions. Specifically, though, I wanted to mention psychologist and economist Per Espen Stoknes, who has some really great research that I've shared in talks over the last year. In my work at Project Drawdown, I've given just over 40 talks in the last year, and I've referenced his research, which is on, in one sense, the 5 main barriers to climate action, and he calls them the 5 inner defenses that we have when it comes to climate. So we see climate as distant. We have a sense of doom. We have cognitive dissonance of like, oh, I have to change the way that I live. That doesn't feel right. So we have all of these barriers that come up and that are sparked by how we communicate about climate traditionally in terms of sharing the crisis and sharing climate news. But the other side of things that he talks about is these 5 S's to more brain-friendly climate communications. And so story is one of them, but we also need stories that are social and talk about people and show people that all of us could relate to. We need stories that show progress, that show like the ways that we could take action that is common sense for us. So for instance, making a shift that leads to more jobs for people is really critical. So there are all these little things that that we could do in how we communicate. And we are, as humans, very drawn to stories, but we're also just very bad at telling effective stories when it comes to climate change. And thankfully, we're becoming more aware of that and starting to see shifts. But that is definitely one of the big challenges that I'm seeing in terms of storytelling and climate solutions.
Thank you. I was listening to you and to what Diogo said earlier, just a moment ago, on environmental issues versus jobs and more earthly concerns or more immediate concerns. And your storytelling that Matt was talking about. Is it difficult, or is it possible, or is it becoming easier to make the connection between climate change and everyday concerns of your parents, your teachers, people that you work with in businesses? Is the climate urgency becoming as present as job security or social security or other issues that classically and traditionally are on the front of people's concerns? If you want to try another way, have you been able to turn climate change in a story of everyday concern for the older generation, the people who are still in jobs and still have today the capacity to make a change? Because I'm not worried about climate change in your generation. Mm-hmm. I'm worried that we don't have a climate to change when it gets to your generation to be in charge. We need to do it now. So is this storytelling and the climate urgency a part of people who are now in charge concerns, or are we still trying to tell that story?
So I think that I don't think the difference is, at least in what I see, I don't think the difference is entirely generational. I think the difference in terms of who is concerned and who is taking action in a lot of ways comes down to power, which is in part generational. So for instance, we see a lot of leaders, whether that's private sector leaders or public sector leaders, who are of that generation above ours, that next generation up or the one above that. And, you know, they aren't necessarily prioritizing action because of self-interest. Like, you know, we have to look at the things that motivate different people when it comes to change. And if someone, for instance, if an executive works with an auto company, it might be very clear to them the ways that they could advance climate action, but at the same time, for whatever reason, maybe for obvious reasons, they might not feel like that is the action that they want to take. I have thankfully seen many people who are from a wide range of ages who care about climate solutions and climate action, but those people don't necessarily have the power to make those quick, safe, equitable, aggressive shifts that we need. And so we definitely need to do better to engage, or actually, I don't even think we need to do better to engage that generation. I think that generation needs to step up and think about how they could use their power and put aside that self-interest to actually create a future where the world still exists. Because I think, for instance, of my mom, who's a grandmother now, and she is has not only my 3-year-old nephew, but also another nephew or niece on the way, and she is so concerned about climate change, thinking about that future, which I know a lot of older people are. But again, they don't necessarily wield the power to make these massive policy shifts and public and private policy shifts that we need. I see Victoria has thought on this too.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very important to call out the importance of power on these dynamics, because climate change is becoming more feasible for people because they are experiencing like droughts and floods. Even it's more often, it's not only in tropical areas, but around the globe. So I think it's becoming a part of their daily lives. And this is at the same time that it has the power to make them realize how urgent it is. At the same time, they are dealing with threats to their own lives. Here in Brazil, we have in the state of Rio de Janeiro, a city called Petrópolis. And recently there has been a huge amount of rain, like in historical comparison, it has been one of the biggest, if not the biggest amount of rain in a short period of time. So they had many affected areas, and over 100 people have already died from this. And there is a story of a young woman, I don't know how old she was, like 20 or in her 30s, but she died the same way that her grandmother did, because there was an effect of these floods ages ago with her grandma. So it means that nothing has changed, because it is the same areas that are being affected, the same communities that are suffering those effects, and they are the ones who need to build their lives around the possibility of tragedies such as these. So it's psychologically speaking, it's also very stressing for those people. And coming again to the part of how politics can influence these realities, I think it's very important to highlight the importance of advocacy initiatives, because through those activism networks and organizations that can call out on the importance of thinking about resilience and thinking about mitigation and adaptation, we can convince perhaps local governments and other authorities on how important it is to have plans to deal with these tragedies. So we don't have that yet here in Brazil, at least. It is now becoming more, I forgot the word, but it is now becoming very important. And we are talking about it more and more, but at the same time, there are those dynamics of power that make it harder for us to achieve joint solutions that are good for people, not only in the future, but right now.
Thank you, Diogo.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, regarding, I guess one of the key questions we also need to ask ourselves is, what are strategies that work? And there's always these two conflicting ideas, and I think they are conflicting, but they might be working at the same time, of push and pull, you know? On one way, try to negotiate with power, try to convince the people in power, but on the other way, also pushing them out of the place where they are, out of the decisions that they can still make. And on my side, at least, or on the side of the climate justice movement, I think we are more and more fed up of these people in power still making the decisions and co-opting our own discourses to then reassuring that real action is not taken. And we can see that, for instance, in the Just Transition movement. This was a movement created by the unions and by the people for us to demand that any kind of transition that would decrease the emissions will also foster social justice and would also provide jobs. And we are seeing the European Union creating this huge plan for just transition to then justify closing power plants and reopening new ones in different places, and then funding the new ones with the same companies. It's the company that's earning the money for the just transition, while the workers that were working on the power plant in Matosinhos, for instance, here in Portugal, are actually out of jobs right now. And so I'm already not trying to believe that we will be able to convince them. We have less than 8 years to reduce in 50% the global emissions. We are creating the movement that will not allow these people to keep taking these decisions forward. And that's what we need to go forward, in my opinion, is that we really need to stop believing that what they've done with our trust is just using it to keep working in the same way that they've been working before. So we are not trusting them no more. We are building the alternatives ourselves, and we are taking that responsibility.
Gabriela?
Yeah, I think both Vitória and Diogo bring up a great point, and I really wanted to highlight kind of the role that youth, right, and the younger generations can play. Like a critical one is, to Diogo's point, like voting them out, like voting those decision makers that do not align with the future that we see out of office. And more and more of the younger generation start to get to that point, I think there's hope in that. And the second one is about kind of this advocacy and the messaging. And as I mentioned, I work for an organization that specializes in changing behaviors, right, and influencing people and decision makers. And I'm familiar with several tools that we call levers that can shift behaviors. And I'll give you two of kind of the most well-known ones. And one of them is like sharing information and kind of building awareness about an issue, right? So telling decision makers about the problem. And I think we can all agree that they already know, like everyone knows there's an issue, right? The second tool or lever that we use is kind of rules and regulations, and making rules, making policies to either mandate or prohibit a behavior. But I think a less well-known one that is often used and wears swag, and it's super, super powerful, is what we call emotional appeal. So speaking to the heart or using emotional messages that can drive certain behaviors. And for this, you can do two main things. You can leverage emotions like pride or love to drive specific actions. And you can start putting a human face on your campaigns and tailoring messages so that they are actually personally relevant, relatable, and appealing. And in my experience working in the field for the past 9 years, I think I've found that family, children, the next generation are important to people, right? We care about our children, we care about our grandchildren well-being, and I think we should be tapping into that. So if we want kind of decision makers to pay more attention, I think youth, right, picking the right messenger and tailoring the messages so they can see how the ones they love, right, are being affected by those choices and policies, it's going to be critical. So those are the two things that I see critical for youth, like using their voting power and using their power to using them as messengers and putting the right message out there as well.
Monica.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of great points were raised already. So for sure, policy and frameworks are going to be very important moving forward in terms of regulating the companies and setting the trajectory that we need to take. And it's also important to realize that when decision makers do discuss incredibly technical things like energy policy or infrastructure policy or trade, who do they invite? They, of course, invite in the companies that are already in the system. So, for example, in Japan, when you look at all the government committees, they are being attended by the major business federation, by the steel federation, by the power sector federation. And youth groups don't get invited to those things. And even as I said, the positive companies, the major stakeholders in this, usually, in the downstream, they're retailers, they're customers of these energy companies, they also very rarely get access. And we really need to change, the dynamics of how policies are being formed and who gets a say in the future policies. And it's really difficult to stand up to that system because, again, like it's a Japanese example, but all of these major groups, they will have their own think tanks. They fund to produce this highly technical, complex research. And of course, they have relationships with the ministries that go back decades. And so how do we make sure that, what goes on behind closed doors is really representative of what the rest of the economy is thinking and what the rest of the people are thinking? And especially for democratic countries, that is something that we must think about.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Monica was saying, even just mentioning this dynamic of who is invited into the room, because so much of my experience before Project Drawdown was thankfully being in many of these rooms where decision makers were having conversations about issues like food and nutrition and about the circular economy, for instance. But the thing that was really difficult for me was, one, I wasn't in the room in those conversations at all the time. I was often there, again, in my role as a storyteller to amplify, which gave me a perspective where I was able to see the lack of diversity in the rooms. Again, it would be people, it wouldn't be activists in the rooms. And I just echo Monica's point that I think that many of these companies and governments and other decision makers have stopped short of actually engaging the voices that will challenge them to aggressively embrace solutions. But the other thing that I want to underscore from what Monica said was just the power of relationships. And going back to what Diogo said, I think that it's easy to lose hope in decision makers, and I don't think I have a ton of hope in many of them at this point, but I do have hope in the power of relationships. And one thing I would encourage for folks is not only to not to choose one approach, to realize that there's not one size fits all approach. So yes, we need to vote, we need to advocate, but we also need to figure out how we could leverage relationships with the people who do currently have power. How do we get in their ears? How do we influence their decision making? And oftentimes, unfortunately, their decision making is influenced by dinner table conversations or coffee conversations, or who am I friends with? Who am I receiving funding from? These are all things that are important to keep in mind as we think about how we could actually positively influence the people in power, because the stories that resonate with them, so stories of that relate to their experiences and who they care about, are great, but sometimes, especially when you're in that position of power, it's easy to overlook that. And so how do we actually directly get in their ears is something that I think about a lot when it comes to decision makers.
Before we move to Q&A, there's one thing that I want to ask all of you. You all obviously engaged in public policy and you are all committed to change society. Any of you consider going into politics to make a change from inside, or politics is a no-no area for you? Strange silence in the room now suddenly.
I think we are all in politics. That's a misconception that that we need to be in a party or be actively militant in a political party.
Let me then rephrase.
Out of politics.
Let me rephrase. Yes, you're all in politics. Would you consider to go into elected office to make changes in public policy, to have the capacity to make changes in public policy directly, and not from influencing or advocacy or from the outside? In other words, would you engage in the democratic process to bring about the changes that you would like to see in your own countries?
I absolutely would, but at the same time, I don't see myself represented. I don't see young people and young women and, you know, people, activists from the climate area. So it's hard to see myself in that position because there are no references, pretty much, or there are few references. And but at the same time, I think it's important because we have many drawbacks when it comes to law and when it comes to the advance of predatory lobbying. And I don't know, we have like, I don't know how to say it in English, but we have a strong influence of the agricultural sector and politics in Brazil. And it's becoming very violent. And we can talk about how I believe Brazil, if not the most, but one of the most affected countries when it comes to people murdering climate activists. So it's hard to be in the center of attention, to call out the importance of climate action. And at the same time, you put a target in your head when you do that. So I think it's very delicate. It's a very delicate issue. But at the same time, I believe that there are more and more people who are wanting to be in those positions because they are positions of power, and how you can change, you can shift the dynamics of power to put it in the hands of people who are more eager to make changes than people who are traditionally in those spaces.
Maybe I could add from my perspective that the biggest thing that I think about, I've thought about this a lot living in Washington, D.C., where so many people, even people who I went to my university with, wanted to be politicians and engaged in politics. But from my perspective, one thing that makes it really difficult is the hyperpartisanship. So there are so many people who you could stand up and you could have a clear idea of what science says and what it supports, and you'll have people who are combating that and pushing back. And you know, in the US for at least as long as I could remember, there has been that challenge of politics kind of pushing and pulling, and rather than us coming to find a consensus, there's conflict. And so the thing that I think is that, you know, not being a politician or not being in a political role might be the way for a lot of us to have more influence than we would otherwise. It's important to have the right people in elected office or appointed offices, but also it's important to have the advocates and activists and other people outside of that who are bolstering their work. So I am not planning on running for office anytime soon. And I also think part of it's the lack of representation, but the other piece of it is it's just things move so slowly, and not because of a conflict of what's right necessarily, but just because of the politics that that have divided us for so long. And I think of the US in particular when I think of that, but I know that that applies to everyone's context, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would also very much agree with what Matt and what Vitória were saying. For me personally, right now, I don't see the way forward, at least in the short term, being part of a political party. I think we hold actually more power outside of political parties right now than we would hold if we were inside the political parties. And also, for that point, I think it's important for us to look to the movement and understand the ecology of the movement. It's a bit of what we've been talking about until now. Like, we need the people inside the parties. We need the people pushing the parties for someplace else. We need the people shouting in the streets. We need the people signing petitions. We need the people inside the corporations. We need all of that. For me, at least in my own analysis, I would say I'm more useful right now outside of those rooms, trying to change the rooms than inside of the rooms, trying to change it from the inside. But that's my answer right now. I don't know if it will be the same answer 10 years from now.
Thank you. Gabriela or Monica, do you want to share your near future with us?
I think what everyone else has shared really resonates with me. Actually, it's funny because my dream growing up was to be like the president of Ecuador. I wanted to be in politics, and I really wanted to work like at the international policy frameworks level, or like be in politics. But I think as I grew, I just became more and more disillusioned with the way that politics like actually worked. And even when you come in at, you know, with your best intentions, sometimes there's structural barriers, or like I think what Matt was alluding to, kind of this inside politics that really don't let you maybe do everything that you want to do. And I think in the US, we see it a lot with kind of more progressive and left-leaning politicians that want to do something about, for instance, climate change. But even though they're in power and they're elected, they really can't do it because the party won't go for it, right? So as I saw those things, I really became disillusioned with that path, and I decided that I could have a lot more impact doing the kind of work that I'm doing right now with policy and advocacy, and actually working with communities who are at the front lines. And I'm really happy with that choice. So you never know what the future could bring. And I think we're seeing more and more like people like us who share our ideas and who share our visions go into power. So maybe in the future, when we start seeing more representation and we start seeing more of a movement and we can overcome those barriers, maybe there's a future there. So you can never know. But for now, I'm happy where I'm at.
And my response would just echo everyone else's. And I would also say that for me at the moment, I am more interested in figuring out what does a 1.5C aligned future look like for different sectors. Like my focus is very much on climate change. You know, I want to make sure the autos transitions, the power sector transitions, and so on. And I realized that when you're in politics, you know, you also have to figure out other problems, and, you know, in addition to navigating the political space and so on. So I think for the time being, I'm happy to be in this specialized role where I get to devote my full attention to this problem.
Thank you. We're going to open now for Q&A. If there's any questions here in the room, please just sign. I have a couple of questions from people watching via Zoom, so I'm going to put it to whoever wants to take the questions. One is about geoethics. Do you think that on your experience about professional regarding environmental and literacy for the planet in your own countries, communities and institutional, what is the role of science and ethics and professions in climate change? Do you face science deniers? Is there an ethic of climate change related to science and knowledge and activism? We have a second question in the room there.
Thank you very much. My question is a little more about yourselves, because dealing with young people, I've noticed a lot of sometimes grief and things. And there's a Brazilian journalist that is dealing with indigenous communities, Luiana, and she mentions that she learned from them that their world has ended with colonization and other things. So like how, and they believe that the end of the world of now is our world ending is more like a middle way than an end. Like it is not going to change abruptly like extinction. I don't really like Extinction Rebellion, but I don't think it's going to be extinction. It's going to be an end of the world, like of our world. Like, how do you deal with this psychologically? And just to finish with that, there's this concept of solastalgia, which is missing your house while you are there, because you know your house will not be there anymore. So like I've been dealing with these testimonies from young people, and I want to know, like, how do you cope with all these feelings that I'm sure is very stressful to deal with somehow? Thank you.
And we have a third question that I'm going to throw in before giving you the floor. Someone watching from home or work or whatever asks if a radical change in the energy mix would not harm millions of people that are unable to cope with a swift change in the energy mix. So we have 3 questions about science and ethics, about the role of young people, and about the impact of energy mix change in the most fragile communities. And any of you would like to take those, or any of those?
Just to start out, and those are a lot of great questions. The one thing that I would start addressing is just the question about climate grief, which is a very real thing that we face. And I really like the aspect of it that you brought into the question, which is that grief isn't only us navigating the things that we've lost already, but there's also grieving. Active grieving is what it's called in the grief world, which I know from like learning a lot and navigating grief and loss, that active grieving is something that could happen or anticipatory grieving is something that could happen when we're looking ahead and saying, oh, I know that I'm going to lose this person, I'm going to lose this thing. Right now, in terms of the ways that climate change is communicated, especially in the news, it's almost impossible not to feel that sense of grief, because we are surrounded by these messages telling us about the things that we're losing, about the world falling apart, about the decision makers not taking action. And so when it comes to how to navigate that grief, well, one thing I would say is that I wish that we were in a world, because I've received this question before, I really wish we were in a world where we weren't resigned to young people feeling climate grief and having to navigate it, but instead the question is, how do we create solutions so that young people don't have that grief and don't have to experience that, and that people in general don't have that. But one thing I would just say is that talking about climate change is so important. With grief in general, it could be powerful to come together with others who are experiencing that to navigate that. I also will say that I, for one, have realized that my job and my work is not, I work every day in service of a goal to end climate change, but my job every day is not to end climate change, if that makes sense. So in essence, when I go to bed and realize that we might still have the same amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as we did at the start of the day, I don't feel overwhelmed, because I realize I only play like one part, one role. The other piece I'll say before kind of handing it to others, maybe to address either that question or one of the others, is that, like, for me, it's so helpful to be part of the solution and to take action. That is how I feel like I've in part navigated climate grief and this sense of hopelessness. Like, knowing that I'm doing at least part of what I can is helpful. And I would encourage young people and anyone to take action, because that helps, at least realizing that like we could get somewhere with these actions that we're taking at scale, of course.
I'd like to take the third question about the radical change in the energy mix and if that's going to hurt vulnerable communities. Well, I think it's important to establish that if we let climate change, if we let global warming go beyond 1.5 degrees C, there will be more extreme weather events and damages, and vulnerable communities will be the first ones to get affected. And so we need to be very clear about those physical parameters that we have and the time scale. I think the IEA net zero report showed that the power sector's trajectory the power sector in developed countries has to get to net zero by 2030, and for developing countries by 2035. So that means we only have 8 years for developed countries and 15, sorry, I'm blanking out there on the math, 13 years for the rest of the world to transition the power sector. Right now, we already have certain solutions. Renewables are getting cheaper, battery storage is getting cheaper. We know that we need to make investments into the grid. It's definitely not an easy transition, but that is why we shouldn't be delaying our action when it's so clear what we need to do, and start changing policies right now, start reinvesting, start the preparations today, as opposed to waiting until it's too late. So I will just end my comment right there that yes, indeed, electricity is an important part of development and economies, and every person should have access to stable, clean electricity around the world. But we shouldn't use that as an excuse to phase out coal-fired power plants, gas power plants, and we need to be very clear that we need to transition our energy mix around the world.
I think the thing about climate grief, it is overwhelming because we experience it individually. So it seems like a huge thing. And when we realize, like Matt was saying, that there are many other people who are experiencing such feelings, the burden feels less heavy. So it is important to share with others how we feel and how we can act towards a future where we accept that it is going to change, but it's not going to mean the end of us. It's going to mean that we will have to adapt ourselves and the way that we produce and the way that we consume. And this is going to be, I believe, the grief in part is because of that, because we are used to one way of living and it won't be like that in the forthcoming years. So this is my take on climate grief. And when it comes to geoethics, I am not familiar with this term, so I wouldn't, just to state that I wouldn't know how to answer that question. And when you talk about energy and shifting like our power matrix, one very important thing is in cities and urban areas around the globe, transport and mobility are like the main issues. It's not necessarily emissions that come from house electricity, and it is more about the way that we leave the city, the way that if we go walk into a place, or if we use a car, or if we do carpool, or if we take the bus. So I believe personally that the main changes in our energy matrix will have to come from this change in urban mobility and in the way that we are used to going to places. So it all comes in the end to accepting that we have to change because the climate is changing. So it makes sense for us to change too. And it is not as bad as we expect, but it will be different. So we have to act for that right now.
For me, the grief question, I would agree with Matt and Victoria on one key thing is feeling that I'm actually doing something to address the problem. And the second one is kind of sharing in networks that think alike. And the third thing for me that has been really helpful is focusing on the positive things. So focusing on what is already changing, what is already working, and on those bright spots. So looking at it from the glass half full instead of glass half empty perspective. Because if I was to focus on everything that's not going well and everything that we're failing at, I think I would have a mental breakdown every single day. So it's about those little steps and that collective sharing those feelings and those actions that has been really helpful. I think I would agree with Victoria on the geoethics. That's kind of a more challenging question to answer because I'm no expert in that. But I imagine there's a role that can be played in kind of guiding, like what are those ethical principles that kind of guide our actions around climate change. So there might be something there. Maybe someone else can dive into that question. And the final point I wanted to make was on the transition in the energy matrix and how that may hurt jobs or people. I think we need to start shifting the way we think about it. As Monica shared, like if we don't do it, it's going to be worse, right? So we need to start shifting that change from a cost to an opportunity. Because when we are transitioning our transportation systems, or we're transitioning the way that we generate our energy, there's an opportunity for people to learn those skills and access those jobs. And it's not only going to have, you know, benefits in terms of job creation, but it's also going to help us solve the climate crisis. So I think we need to stop thinking about it as a cost, even though it will have a cost, right? It'll take time for people to learn the new skills. It is a little more expensive still to rely on the clean energy, but only because of the subsidies that the fossil fuel industry still gets, right? I think we need to start shifting that, right? And also policy changes are going to be key in this energy matrix transition, because again, we need to eliminate those subsidies. We need to really make it a priority to any clean project, or any new energy projects need to be clean. So I think there's again, a shift that needs to happen there, and an incredible opportunity that we're faced with.
Thank you. Diogo?
Yeah, I'm just going to try to go for the third question. I think it's the one I can add the most, and departing also from what was already said by Monica and from the rest of the panel, that we need to understand that we also have a cost of not doing the things that need to be done, but that the feeling of people in vulnerable communities, that if we make this change very quickly in the same system that we are on right now, it's their lives that are going to be the cost of this transition. And these are the people that are in the front lines of climate change. They are the least responsible and they are the most affected. And that's why I really believe, deeply believe, that we cannot have climate action without climate justice. And that's kind of a paradox. That's a big rift in the climate justice movement and in the climate movement and in COPs and international negotiations on why should we center on justice? Why don't we tackle one issue at a time? Why are you then coming up with housing and jobs and so many other things, you know, instead of just focusing on reducing greenhouse gases? And then we see what happens, for instance, in France, when you tax carbon and you increase the price on fuels, and the people that have the least money to pay for their fuel and they have the least opportunities to have mobility around the city, they are the ones that are going to pay for this transition. And so they protest and they come outside and they almost topple a government on this. So for me, the thing is trying to see on history what's been done before. We've made these changes before. In World War II, there were huge changes in a very short amount of time that were popular changes, and they shifted completely the economy and the way the economy works. The thing is, they centered justice in many ways. And they centered justice because the people in power knew that if they didn't center in justice when they are rationing food, for instance, or when they are taking factories to rebuild them for a war effort, if they don't center in justice, people are not going to support this war effort that was going to be done. And the good news here is that we can do this centered in justice, and we can do this moving forward without it needing to be a war in the same sense of the World War II, with millions of people dying. Actually, this is a war we need to win for millions of people not to die.
Thank you. Matthijs, you raised your hand.
The one thing I wanted to just add, in part to address the initial question just about, which I was really taking as a question not only about ethics but and science, but more broadly about roles, is that I work with someone at Project Drawdown by the name of Jamie Alexander, who so brilliantly said in a TED Talk about a year ago that every job is a climate job, or every job can be a climate job. And even her stating this and sharing this through her work at Drawdown Labs, a program focused on working with businesses, has been really helpful for me to see that all of us have a role when it comes to climate solutions. And so if there's one point I wanted to just quickly make now, it's that you don't need to be a politician or in political office to be responsible for this. You don't need to be in one of the corporations that's damaging our planet to be responsible. Like, we all have a role that we could play to make our job more climate friendly, to make it more aligned with climate action. And I think it's in those roles where we could ensure that we're bringing ethics and that we're ensuring that climate solutions are at the forefront. For instance, I think of randomly like one event that I was a part of a couple years ago with one of these corporations, a global corporation, and it was an event at their headquarters. And we walked into their space for an event focused on the circular economy and sustainability. And there were plastic, it might have even been styrofoam utensils, but just utensils that were not great for the planet. And we said, we're not going to use these. I don't know where we're going to find them, but let's get some glass plates or some silverware or whatever it might be. And we were able to replace those materials to use ones that are more environmentally friendly. Well, that might not have an impact to emissions in the long run in any significant way, but I think that's the type of action that we need. It's people kind of questioning the world around them and realizing that they can be part of the solution.
Thank you. I'm going to close the panel now. I would like to, first I would like to say that we have people in this panel from Europe, Asia, North America, Central America, South America. Unfortunately, we had invited Luiana Guerra from Angola, but the connection was not good enough for her to join us. But young people from all over the world are saying exactly the same thing. Climate change and climate action now. I'm just sorry that you're not willing to engage in the democratic process as actors, and I hope to change that in time. I'd like to thank Diogo, Gabriela, Matt, Monica, and Vitória for a really engaging and good panel for closing our conference on today. I'd like also to take the chance, and I'm going to switch to Portuguese to close the conference. Eu queria agradecer a todos os oradores que estiveram connosco durante este dia e meio, a todas as pessoas que estiveram connosco durante este dia e meio aqui na sala, na Agência Europeia de Segurança Marítima e em casa, a agência que nos recebeu e recebeu muito bem durante este dia e meio, aos nossos parceiros, à Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa, à Observadora, ao Sustainable Ocean Alliance Hub Portugal e ao Youth Climate Leaders, a toda a equipe técnica que teve muito mais trabalho do que alguma vez nós pensámos que eles fossem ter, e por fim um agradecimento especial à Embaixada do Japão, do Senhor Embaixador, pela cooperação e o apoio que o Japão deu a esta conferência.